Exclusive contract with Feilu Novel Network Novel. Man in Navigation. The strongest death god inherited at the beginning. Carlos traveled through the world of pirates and obtained the strongest inheritance system, receiving the inheritance of the strongest Grim Reaper Yamamoto Yo. The ghost-slaying fist is all his weapon. From then on, the strongest person in the history of the Navy was born. He is the true world's largest swordsman, possessing the power to destroy the world. And this is just the beginning. Feilu Novel Network reminds you that this novel and its characters are purely fictional. If there are any similarities, they are purely coincidental and should not be imitated. Chapter 1. The Strongest Inheritance System. You are listening at Novel Full.Audio. 11 years of the Age of the Pirates. Naval Headquarters, Marinfando. The afterglow of the sunset falls on the earth, making it particularly beautiful. A teenager is currently holding a bamboo knife in his hand and practicing the simplest chopping techniques in a very simple courtyard. My physical strength is still too poor after all. Carlos exhaled a soft breath and sat cross-legged on the ground, with a bitter smile on the corner of his mouth. He is a traveler. I came to this world more than a decade ago and became an orphan of a naval headquarters colonel. I inexplicably came to this pirate world where the strong are revered. Carlos was very excited at first. Because this is a wonderful and diverse world, a great swordsman who breaks the sea with a single sword, a mysterious demon fruit ability, and a powerful physical and martial artist who shakes the sky and earth with a single punch, all make him yearn for it. But when he was old enough to practice, he realized that he was just a mediocre person and had no way to become a demon fruit power. Compared to his peers, he had no advantage at all, which made him feel hopeless. Because in this world, being weak is original sin. He doesn't want his fate to be controlled by others. Ding, the strongest inheritance system is activated. Does the host accept inheritance? At this moment, an emotionless voice rang out in Carlos's mind. Accept. Carlos looked delighted and immediately chose to accept. How could he possibly refuse this obvious golden finger, as he was eager to change his fate? Ding, congratulations to the host. You have obtained the strongest Grim Reaper, the inheritance of Yamamoto Motonari Ryuzai Shigekuni, with an inheritance rate of plus 10%. Ding, congratulations to the host, you have obtained the flowing blade like fire. Wait until the cold voice in my mind disappears. In just an instant, Carlos felt a tremendous change in his body, full of explosive power. And there is also a strong and powerful energy flowing in one's own body, which is probably called spiritual pressure. Host. Carlos inheritance role. Yamamoto Motonari Shigekuni inheritance. 10%, surprisingly, it is Yamamoto Motonari Shigekatsu. Carlos looked at the system panel in his mind, with an excited smile on his face. With the strongest inheritance of the Grim Reaper, he can finally control his own destiny. In the blink of an eye, a seemingly ordinary knife had already appeared in Carlos's hand, as if it were a flowing blade like fire. Although this sword may not look impressive on the outside, it is the strongest soul-slaying sword in the Hot series, possessing the strongest attack power among all soul-slaying swords. After the initiation, the flame temperature reached as high as 6,000 degrees Celsius on the surface of the sun, enough to burn everything. After the dissolution of the swastika, the temperature reached 15 million degrees Celsius at the core of the sun. Even if nothing was done, it was enough to evaporate the entire world's water and destroy it. Carlos took a deep breath, calmed down his emotions, and began to communicate with the system to understand how to improve inheritance. Ultimately, it was found that the method was very simple and crude, requiring only self-cultivation or combat to increase inheritance. Carlos stood up from the ground and gently pulled out the flowing blade, stirring up his spiritual pressure and attaching it to it. Let me see, how powerful are you? Carlos muttered to himself in a low voice, then swung down towards the land ahead, his flowing blade reaching like a blazing fire, and the surrounding air seemed to have fallen into a stagnant state. Buzz. In just an instant, a slash had already burst out from the flowing blade like fire, instantly piercing through the sky. Click. The land in front of Carlos instantly exploded, creating a ravine 2 zhang away. Carlos saw this scene and a satisfied smile appeared on his face. He didn't give it his all just to be safe, but his power remained so amazing. I don't know how terrifying that force will be when I can liberate the swastika. Carlos recalled the remnants of the fire Tai Dao in his memory, with a hopeful expression on his face. Next, Carlos continued to experiment with his own strength, and after finally making a rough judgment, he turned around and returned to his own room, briefly rinsing it. I picked up a book from my own bed and started flipping through it. This book is one of the legacies of my predecessor's father, and it talks about the cultivation of swordsmanship. Carlos's previous cultivation was based on the teachings in this book. Although Carlos has inherited the legacy of Yamamoto Motonari, he is not prepared to give up his swordsmanship in the world of pirates. Although he can strike with a slash, strictly speaking, it is the sword pressure generated by attaching spiritual pressure to the sword. He is very much looking forward to the extent to which his strength will reach when the two are combined. Chapter 2. New Barracks. You are listening at novel full.audio. In the courtyard. Carlos was naked on his upper body, constantly waving his flowing blade like fire. It has been half a month since Carlos received the inheritance of the strongest Grim Reaper. During this period, Carlos devoted himself wholeheartedly to his cultivation and did not leave his home. Carlos can clearly feel that his inheritance progress is gradually increasing. And Carlos found that his qualifications seemed to have become extraordinary, even his swordsmanship cultivation was advancing rapidly. Carlos really likes the feeling of constantly getting stronger. And there were also some changes in the system panel in his mind. Host. Carlos inheritance role. Yamamoto Motonari Shigekuni inheritance rate. 10.9%. Suddenly, the door to Carlos's house was pushed open. Carlos, are you there? With a sound, a teenage girl had already walked in. What's up with you, Ian? After seeing Ian appear and sheathing the flowing blade like fire, Carlos smiled at the corner of his mouth. Humph, I just came to see if some guy has died after not going out for so long. Angio snorted and immediately saw Carlos's naked upper body, staring in place. Ah. At the next moment, Ian exclaimed in shock and ran out in an instant. Carlos, why don't you wear clothes? Outside the gate came the voice of Ian's embarrassment and annoyance. Carlos twitched slightly at the corner of his mouth. Is there any mistake? It's better if you came in without knocking on the door. And it's just the upper body, do you want it to look like this? Carlos shook his head helplessly, picked up the clothes next to him, put them on, and walked out the door. Immediately, I saw Ian, whose face was flushed and spinning in place. Ian, come on, what the hell is going on? Carlos pretended not to see Ian's blushing face and quickly found a topic. Carlos and Ian, both of their parents were in the Navy and died in the same war, becoming orphans together. The places where both sides live are also extremely close, coupled with the situation of sharing the same illness, the two naturally become childhood sweethearts. Here, I have brought you the invitation from the Navy's new recruits training camp. Ian's pretty face still had a faint blush, and he rolled his beautiful eyes at Carlos before handing over an invitation letter in his hand. Upon hearing this, Carlos also showed a hint of clarity. As naval orphans, this is one of their benefits. After reaching a certain age, one will receive this invitation. However, this does not necessarily mean that one can become a new recruit in the headquarters, it is just an opportunity. To officially join the training camp, you still need to pass some tests. Well, thank you very much. Carlos took the invitation letter with ease. How many times have you said it? Don't say thank you to me. Ian pouted in great displeasure. Carlos looked at Ian's expression and felt a hint of warmth in his heart. In this world, it's probably only Ian who truly cares about himself. Anyway, even if you can't become a Navy, it's okay. I'll always be by your side. Ian looked at Carlos, a blush appearing on his pretty face once again, and finally fled as if he had escaped. This girl. Carlos watched as Ian's figure disappeared into the night, with a slight smile on his lips. Carlos withdrew his gaze and looked at the invitation letter in his hand, with a resolute expression on his face. Although I have gained my own system, even if I don't join the Navy, it's nothing. However, the Navy has the most complete system and is indeed the most suitable place for itself today. 3 days later. Carlos went to the new recruits training camp and easily passed the assessment. After all, the so-called assessment is nothing more than the most basic weight-bearing long-distance running, testing a person's physical strength and endurance. If it were true that it was a bit dangerous for oneself to pass through in the past, but now it is not at all difficult. Early in the morning, as today is the official day to report at the training camp, Carlos woke up early. After washing up, Carlos stood in front of the mirror, dressed in a new Navy uniform, tidying up his collar. If I had this kind of capital in my past life, I wouldn't have had a girlfriend. Carlos looked in the mirror, full of heroic spirit, and his incredibly handsome self couldn't help but sigh softly. After finishing his outfit, Carlos went out of the house, found Ian, and went to the new recruit training camp with her. By the time they arrived, the new recruits training camp was already crowded with Navy recruits wearing military uniforms. The entire new recruits training camp was divided into 10 small teams to accommodate thousands of naval recruits here. Carlos and Ian had good luck and were both assigned to the 5th team. Chapter 3. Finding Trouble. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Carlos and Ian arrived at their team under the leadership of a naval lieutenant colonel. At this time, the original team members are undergoing free training. Okay. So handsome. The arrival of Carlos and others immediately caught everyone's attention, especially some female recruits whose eyes were fixed on Carlos's sharp and angular face. These flower enthusiasts. Ian immediately noticed these gazes and looked at these women with some dissatisfaction. Damn it, it's just having a handsome face. What's so remarkable about it? The actions of the surrounding girls immediately aroused the dissatisfaction of other veterans. Humph, when the training is over, let's go teach this new recruit a lesson together. A man with blonde hair stared fiercely at Carlos and said fiercely. Huh, that's right, everything follows Ross boss. Some other veterans nodded one after another. Carlos's perception was very keen now, and he immediately felt Ross's gaze that was different from others. His brow furrowed slightly, and then a disdainful sneer appeared. If someone really comes to provoke him, he will definitely give the other person an unforgettable lesson. As all the new recruits from the 5th team gradually arrived, the instructor also arrived late and appeared in the training ground. The instructor first gathered everyone and then explained the theory of the Navy. Listening to the instructor talking about justice in front, all the new recruits were boiling with enthusiasm because that was the reason they joined the Navy. However, Carlos was clearly not among them, and he remained indifferent from beginning to end. He is familiar with the plot, but he knows how corrupt the world government is. Although the Navy is slightly better, it is not much stronger. Moreover, Carlos's outlook on life has long been mature, and he deeply knows that justice is just synonymous with victory. And all he has to do is leverage the naval training system to become stronger and fearless of any threat. After the instructor's lengthy speech, normal training finally began. Training is not very difficult, it's nothing more than some exercises to strengthen physical fitness. When a process ends, it's time for rest. Carlos didn't rest with the others, but instead focused on his own cultivation. However, soon after, an unpleasant voice rang out. Hello, new here. Carlos turned his head and saw Ross walking over with 2 veterans. Is there anything I need to do? Carlos said indifferently. It's nothing, I just want you to know the rules here. Ross's lips curved into a sneer. Oh, it's interesting. So I want to know, what are the rules here? Carlos looked at Ross, his gaze gradually turning cold. The distant instructor frowned slightly upon seeing this scene, but did not come over to stop it. After all, in the barracks, it has always been a tradition for veterans to teach new recruits. Ross is going to bully people again. Everyone also noticed the situation here, with different expressions on their faces. All the male recruits looked gloating, and Carlos's handsome face also made them somewhat unhappy. The female recruit, on the other hand, had a straight face, but was afraid of Ross and dared not step forward. What do you want to do? Ian ran over quickly, with an angry expression on his face. Hands on. Ross ignored it and shouted loudly. Upon receiving Ross's order, the two veterans standing behind him directly chose to take action. They were very fast and had already reached Carlos, while also throwing out their fists. Be careful, Carlos. Upon seeing this scene, Ian let out a cry of surprise and a look of panic appeared on his face. The cooperation is very tacit. But unfortunately, you are too weak. As Carlos's words fell, he could only be seen gently raising his hand knife, and then his figure had completely disappeared. Bang! Bang! In the next moment, Carlos appeared behind these two veterans, standing on the ground. At the same time, both veterans rolled their eyes and collapsed on the ground. Is this? Upon seeing this scene, Ian couldn't help but grow his mouth and his eyes were filled with surprise, appearing particularly cute. This kid's strength seems to be good. But unfortunately, he's against Ross. The instructor standing on the side also showed surprise, but in the end, he shook his head. As for Ross's strength, he is all too clear. As the son of a general in this department, he is definitely the strongest in his team. It seems that I underestimated you. Ross saw that his two subordinates were unexpectedly killed by Carlos, and a hint of surprise appeared on his face. Unfortunately, you are not my opponent. Ross's face showed a cruel smile, and his long sword slowly unsheathed from his waist. Chapter 4. Initial Strength Manifestation. You are listening at novel.Audio. Carlos, don't fight him. Ian looked at the two people in the field with swords and crossbows, and quickly shouted. Don't worry, Ian, I will win. Carlos looked at Ian with a confident tone and a sense of defiance emanating from his body, causing Ian to lose his composure. Humph, it's shameless to speak big. Ross's face showed a cold smile, and he took a step forward. His body was shot out like a sharp arrow, and his long sword turned into a cold light in the air, chopping towards Carlos. Ross lives up to the reputation of being the strongest in the 5th team, and just this sword alone is enough to kill more than 90% of the people in the new recruit training camp. But in the face of this imposing sword, Carlos had no intention of avoiding it. He just clenched his fist with one hand, bent his arm slightly, and fired a sword towards the front. What does he want to do? Strike the blade with your fist. Everyone saw this scene and their mouths grew wide. Damn it. The instructor is also a bit anxious, he doesn't want Carlos, this good seedling, to be buried here. But even if he wants to stop it now, he is still powerless. But in the next moment, as Carlos' fist was completely released, everyone showed a look of shock. Boom. Carlos hit the air with his fist, and the surrounding air seemed to melt into substance, directly hitting the blade. Click. With a crisp sound, Ross's long sword in his hand unexpectedly showed visible cracks, and eventually completely shattered. Ross also spat out blood and flew backwards, landing on the ground in a disheveled state. How could this be possible? What exactly happened? Everyone looked incredulous, and their eyes were filled with a look of shock. Ian also looked surprised, completely surprised that Carlos's strength had reached such a level. At this moment, the instructor also widened his eyes and looked incredulous. Unlike these new recruits, he was very clear about what Carlos had done, striking the air with a powerful force, creating a punch like a shell. This kind of power doesn't matter much when it appears on some strong individuals, but when it appears on a new recruit, it is simply outrageous. You guy, what strange power. Ross swallowed the blood foam in his mouth and stood up from the ground, his face appearing extremely fierce with extreme anger. The strength is not very good, but the defense is quite good. Carlos looked at Ross, who seemed to be not seriously injured, and was also somewhat surprised. You bastard. Ross immediately became furious when he heard Carlos's contemptuous words. I'll show you the difference between you and me. With a roar from Ross, a very fierce aura erupted from all over his body, and his muscles bulged up and down, eventually transforming into a huge black cow that was only 10 feet tall. Ross is actually an animal-type demon fruit power expert. Everyone watched Ross's changes and exclaimed in surprise. Fruit-powered individuals are not a big deal, even in places where elites gather, they are extremely rare. After all, the most ordinary animal-type demon fruit can be worth at least 100 million belly or more, and it still has value but no market. Ross ignored the reactions of the people around him and instead looked at Carlos with murderous intent. Bang! With a muffled sound, Ross had already stomped on the ground with both hooves. In the moment the ground shattered, it rushed towards Carlos like a runaway locomotive. Bang! Bang! Every time his 4 hooves strike down, the earth emits a mournful sound. The terrifying aura caused by Ross turned everyone around pale. So strong, really strong. Ross, this guy should not stay here, but go to the elite training camp. Everyone looked at Ross with a look of shock in their eyes. Carlos. Ein was also panicked and shouted out loud. Ross wants to kill. The instructor also had an angry expression on his face, and he couldn't tell that the other party was going to kill Carlos under the pretext of accidental mishandling. At this moment, the instructor deeply regretted not preventing this from happening. Is this your trump card, but that's all? Carlos watched as Ross rushed towards him, his expression not changing at all. He just clenched his fist again and threw it forward. Boom! Carlos's fist hit Ross's bull head directly, emitting an intense roar. The invisible wind, centered around both, swept in all directions. The dust in the sky also stirred up, completely enveloping the two, making it difficult for people to see anything inside. How's it going? Everyone looked at the dusty battlefield ahead with an extremely tense expression on their faces. Carlos. At this moment, Ein's eyes were already tinged with tears, and he clenched his fists tightly to prevent himself from crying. She has made up her mind that if anything unexpected happens to Carlos, even if everything is done, she will seek revenge for him. Brush. At this moment, a piercing sound echoed through the air, and everyone could only see that Ross's huge figure had already flown out of the smoke and dust, sliding out of a deep groove on the ground. Chapter 5. Respected people. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Above the campsite. The smoke and dust gradually dissipated, and Carlos's intact figure had appeared in front of everyone. Damn it! Ross gritted his teeth and looked at Carlos, feeling the real pain on his forehead, with a look of shock all over his face. He didn't expect to lose in terms of strength. This farce should also come to an end. Carlos walked lightly towards Ross. Humph, don't be so proud. Keep fighting, I don't know who will win or lose. Ross, who is naturally arrogant, is not prepared to give up. He plans to use his rough skin and thick flesh to grind Carlos to death. Is that right? Carlos smiled playfully, and a faint killing intent flashed in his eyes. In the next moment, Carlos held onto the handle of the blazing sword with one hand, emitting an incredibly fierce aura from top to bottom. This. Ross looked at Carlos, whose hand was caressing like a blazing fire, and felt a great fear enveloping his whole body, causing him to instinctively take a step back. What a joke, I'm afraid of just a new recruit. Ross has a fierce expression, but he is destined to join the elite training camp. As if to deny that fear, Ross's figure changed and he entered a state of being half human and half beast, swiftly rushing towards Carlos. There are so many flaws. But forget it, as the first capable person I have encountered, there is a value of one strike. Carlos took a gentle step and made a gesture of drawing his sword. The first move of, flowing blade like fire, stroke and chop. As Carlos's words fell, his figure had disappeared into place. In the next moment, Carlos's figure appeared again and had already moved 10 meters away. Not far behind him was Ross, who was stiff in place. Puzzy. A large amount of blood shot out directly from Ross's body, and a bone-deep sword mark also appeared on his body. Carlos lightly swung his flowing blade like fire, a strand of blood reflecting on the ground, and then sheathed his sword. Bang! By the time the flowing blade was completely sheathed, Ross's figure had fallen into a pool of blood. Ross. Lost. Everyone who saw this scene had their mouths wide open and their faces full of disbelief. Carlos. Ian also had an excited expression, ignoring everything and rushing straight into Carlos's arms. Don't worry, I have nothing to do. Carlos touched Ian's hair with a spoiled expression on his face. Humph, I'm not worried about you. Ian pushed Carlos away, her pretty face like a red apple, and ran away quickly. At this moment, the distant instructor also reacted and quickly came over to check Ross's injuries. Immediately, it was discovered that although Ross was unlikely to die, his injuries were extremely severe and he would definitely leave behind hidden wounds, mostly rendering him useless. Ross is the son of General Ron, you need to be careful in the future. The instructor looked at Carlos and whispered softly. Thank you very much for the instructor's reminder. Carlos nodded with a calm expression. I don't regret the heavy blow to Ross. If the son of a general who had a murderous heart for himself stays, it will definitely be a great concern. Sigh. The instructor looked at Carlos and let out a soft sigh. He couldn't bear Carlos, a genius, to face General Ron's revenge. But at this point, he had no way out. In the end, the instructor announced that today's training was over and took Ross away with the medical staff. Carlos didn't make much of a stop and left the camp with Ian, under the revered gaze of everyone. Within the courtyard, Carlos looked straight ahead, with a finger pointing forward. Breaking the fourth path, white thunder. As Carlos spoke, a thunderbolt burst out from his fingertips and exploded directly on the ground ahead. The power is good. Carlos looked at the damage he had caused ahead and a smile appeared on his lips. As the strongest Grim Reaper, Yamamoto Motonari Shigekuni has reached the pinnacle of both ghost slaying and battle. Whether it's swordsmanship represented by chopping, ghostly path represented by ghosts, instant steps represented by walking, or physical skills represented by boxing. All of them have been of great help to him. And among them, the ghost path is clearly the most special one, and Carlos is preparing to temporarily hide it. After all, this is something that the world does not understand. Before you have the power to protect yourself, it is better not to let others know unless absolutely necessary. Next, Carlos looked at the system panel in his mind. Host. Carlos Inheritance Role. Yamamoto Motonari Shigekuni Inheritance. 11.6%. Did you actually improve so much? Carlos looked at his inheritance level and couldn't help but be slightly surprised. I immediately understood the reason, which was probably because I defeated Ross today. It seems we need to fight more people. Carlos touched his chin and showed a thoughtful expression. Chapter 6. Breathing of Everything. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Time flies by in a hurry. It has been a month since Carlos defeated Ross. During this period, Ross did not appear again. As for his father, Carlos also learned from the instructor that he was on a mission and could not return to headquarters in the short term. Carlos's life has also become a two-way street, commuting between training camp and home. During this month, Carlos devoted himself wholeheartedly to his cultivation. Most of the time, I practice based on the notes left by my predecessor's father, hoping to understand the breathing of all things. The so-called breathing of all things is a realm. Any swordsman who wants to become a swordsman must understand the power. And as for how to cultivate, it is recorded very clearly in that notebook. After all, the father of his predecessor was a swordsman. However, knowing the method does not necessarily mean that one can learn it. Talent and understanding are indispensable. Otherwise, Jianhao would have run everywhere long ago. At this moment, Carlos is constantly waving his flowing blade like fire in the courtyard, adjusting his breathing consciousness according to the content in his notes. Carlos didn't use any force, just a simple sword swing. Slowly, Carlos only felt as if he had entered a wonderful realm, as if his mind had become ethereal. Her eyes also became incredibly clear, as if there was only the sword in her own hand in them. And his perception became incredibly sharp, as if everything around him had fallen into a state of stagnation. All things in the world are silent. Only the sound of one's own heartbeat is constantly ringing. Is this the realm where all things breathe? Carlos had a smile on his face and turned his gaze to the stone table not far from him, completely concentrating his mind on it. Gradually, he seemed to hear the sound of breathing on the stone table. Carlos put down his flowing blade like fire and picked up the navy-style long sword that had already fallen to ashes next to him. Brush. The long sword unsheathed and left a cold light in the air, effortlessly piercing through the stone table. Bang! Bang! With two muffled noises, the stone table had already split in half and hit the ground. It seems that I have truly gained a glimpse into the realm of swordsmen. Carlos looked at the smooth cutting surface of the stone table, with the corners of his mouth slightly raised. I don't know how far there is to truly become a swordsman. Carlos touched his chin with a thoughtful expression on his face. At this point in Kendo, the notes of my predecessor's father are no longer useful. The other party is just the degree to which they have just understood the breathing of all things. Otherwise, he wouldn't just be a naval colonel. However, according to the memory of the original work, Carlos knew that a true swordsman must be able to easily cut steel. Don't think that by listening to the breath of all things, you can cut off steel. This is not such a simple thing. After all, there are many types of things in the world, each with different intensities. Just like Eagle Eye, the world's strongest swordsman, although he can cut mountains and seas with just a wave of his hand, his sword energy is still blocked by the diamond jaws. Although Eagle Eye definitely did not give it all, at least it shows one thing. Even the world's largest swordsman is not an existence that can be cut off by anything. Try and see. Carlos turned around and returned to the room, taking out a piece of paper, recalling the scene when Zhangselang taught Sauron. If you don't want to chop it, you can't even chop off the paper. Carlos murmured to himself in a low voice, tossing up the paper in his hand and once again entering that state, waving his navy sword. The blade passed by and easily split the white paper in half in the air. Sure enough, isn't it that simple? Carlos couldn't help but shake his head and smile bitterly when he saw this scene. Because only the ability to freely control whether to cut off that piece of paper is the sign of cutting steel. However, Carlos was not discouraged. He was just a breath of understanding all things, and he never thought about reaching the sky in one step. Carlos took a deep breath, took out a large amount of white paper again, and began to keep trying. Time began to pass rapidly. At this moment, Carlos felt as if he had encountered a novel toy and enjoyed it all. As more and more white paper was divided in half on the ground, Carlos only felt his condition getting better and better, as if he had touched something in the dark. Shoo! The long sword passed by, and the paper floating in the air was not split in half. Have you finally succeeded once? Carlos nodded lightly when he saw this scene. What he needs to do next is to improve his success rate. When he can achieve this 100%, it means that he has truly succeeded and become a true swordsman. Chapter 7. Waiting for the Rabbit. You are listening at novel full.audio. Above the training camp. All members of the 5th Brigade gathered and lined up neatly. In front of everyone is their instructor. Next, I want to announce something. The instructor glanced around and paused briefly on Carlos in the front row before loudly saying, "The annual practical assessment of the new recruits training camp is about to begin. Those who can achieve excellent results are eligible to participate in the selection of elite training camps." As soon as this sentence was spoken, everyone showed an excited expression. You should know that if you can enter the elite training camp, you can receive guidance from former Navy General and current Navy Commander-in-Chief, Zefa. And now the 3 naval generals, Red Dog, Green Pheasant, and Yellow Ape, all come from elite training camps and are all disciples of Zefa. In addition, new recruits who graduate from regular training camps only hold the highest rank of lieutenant. But in the elite training camp, the minimum is also a captain. The starting point for both sides is completely different. It can be said that as long as you successfully enter the elite training camp, it is a good thing to achieve success step by step. Have you finally arrived? Carlos also showed a smile. Joining the elite training camp is also one of his goals. After all, having a strong general like Zefa's words and deeds will make his path to strength smoother. Not to mention, how much inheritance can he gain in this practical assessment? But it's a pity, Ross is afraid to miss this opportunity this year. A new soldier shook his head and said, "Missing this year, are you joking? According to my information, whether he can fight in the future is unknown." Another recruit carefully glanced at Carlos before whispering, "Don't mention Ross, he deserves it too. Who makes him always bully people?" Another recruit interjected. Silence. The instructor looked at the whispering below and immediately frowned, shouting loudly. All the new recruits immediately shut up. This practical assessment will take place 3 days later. The instructor continued. There hasn't been any training these days, you need to hurry up and prepare. Thus, disband. 3 days later. 10 large warships are displayed in the harbor. Countless new Navy soldiers were arranged by a group of instructors to form teams here, but they did not follow the original personnel of the 10 battalions, but completely disrupted them. Even Carlos and Ian were separated. I finally saw some original characters. Carlos, standing in the queue, looked around at some familiar figures and also smiled. For example, Drake, who later became the captain of the Navy's classified unit. Tina, who was promoted to Rear Admiral of the Navy. They are all the new forces of the Navy in the future. After a period of time, a figure appeared at the port, and it was none other than the Navy Chief Instructor, Black Wrist Zefa. Let's get started. Black Wrist Zefa arrived on the leading warship and gave instructions to a Rear Admiral. Yes. The Rear Admiral immediately began issuing orders. All the new Navy recruits were divided into 10 parts and began to board the warships. After 10 warships left the port, they arrived at a sea area and were all separated, with different destinations. The warship where Carlos was located was relatively calm along the way, and even occasional attacks from small sea kings were dismissed by the Rear Admiral on board. Finally, the warship arrived at a small island. At a glance, this small island is surrounded by vegetation, and the roar of wild beasts can be faintly heard. This is where your practical assessment is located. The first Rear Admiral, standing on top of Class A, took out 2 red and blue number plates from his arms and said, "These 2 types of number plates, blue scattered throughout the island, and red on the ferocious beasts' bodies. The blue number plate represents 1 point, and the red number plate represents 5 points. There are a total of 1,000 points on the island. As long as you bring your number card back to the warship, you can earn the corresponding score for an unlimited number of times. This assessment lasts for 1 day and allows for the use of any form of combat. Players can engage in battles and compete for number cards. However, one thing to note is that intentional homicide is not allowed. This assessment has been fully monitored, and there are surveillance phone worms everywhere. The rear admiral glanced around and said with a serious expression. So I announce that this practical assessment has officially begun. As the rear admiral's words fell, all the new Navy soldiers began to move, jumping off the warship and running towards the depths of the island. However, only one person remained motionless, and it was none other than Carlos. I only saw Carlos wait for everyone to leave before slowly getting off the warship and finally stopping on the necessary path to the warship. Carlos's idea is very simple. Instead of struggling to find the number plate, it's better to wait here and wait for someone to deliver it. Although this method is effective, it is very dangerous. After all, no one knows what kind of guy there is among these new recruits. But Carlos is different. He has absolute confidence in his own strength. At least within this island, there is no one worth his attention. Chapter 8. Zefa's Expectations. You are listening at novel.Audio. Within the island. Quickly, someone discovered the blue number plate that was almost displayed on the surface. Some go to battle with fierce beasts. But more importantly, they are grabbing the number cards that others have already obtained. Because everyone realizes that the essence of this assessment is to test their own strength. Wars of all sizes began to erupt continuously. However, due to the rules, no one dares to kill anyone. After all, the surveillance phone worms around are not just decorations. And some new recruits who have obtained a considerable number of number plates are starting to move towards the direction of the warship with all their might. Because no one is a fool, as long as they don't get on the warship, so many number plates are useless. It is unwise to keep these number plates in hand and constantly risk being snatched. It's better to switch to points quickly to make it more practical. This is a burly man with more than 10 red and blue number plates in his arms. He arrived not far from the warship, but encountered Carlos who had been guarding here all along. You. The strong man's gaze flickered for a moment, and he immediately understood Carlos's intention, with a fierce expression on his face. Someone dares to be so arrogant, let me see your skills. Navy Type 6, Lan Jiao. As he spoke, the strong man had already swept his leg between them, and a slash had already burst out. He plans to teach this kid a good lesson. But the next moment, the strong man widened his eyes. Boom. Seeing only his own slashing, Carlos simply threw a seemingly casual punch and completely shattered it. What are you joking about? The burly and strong man had a frightened expression, leaving a cold sweat on his forehead. What kind of power is this when one punch shatters one's own lawn foot? Are you the one who defeated that guy Ross? Finally, the burly man recognized Carlos's identity. After all, Carlos has replaced Ross as the first person in the 5th team, which is still somewhat well-known. Even so, it's too exaggerated. The burly man swallowed his saliva hard, his face full of disbelief. If you don't want to get hurt, it's best to bring the number plate over. Carlos whispered to the burly man. Don't look down on people. The burly man's face changed when he heard the words. He is also one of the best among the new recruits. Even if Carlos is stronger than expected, it is impossible for him to give in. That's really regrettable. Carlos shook his head lightly, and with just one step forward, he had already arrived at the burly man, who was punched out. Navy Style 6, Paper Drawing. The burly man's pupils shrank and his figure seemed to turn into a piece of paper, avoiding Carlos's punch. Navy Type 6, Lan Jiao, Chaos. At the same time, one leg of the burly man left a trail of shadows in mid-air, and a large number of slashes burst out like a storm, enveloping Carlos. I guess I can't stop it. The burly man stared fixedly at Carlos, panting heavily. Using this move was also a significant expense for him. I have some skills. Carlos looked at the burly man with a slight surprise. I didn't expect this guy to not only master 2 types of naval 6 styles, but even achieve the development of Lan Jiao. Undoubtedly, it is the training camp of the Navy headquarters, with a wealth of talents. Unfortunately, it is still too weak. Carlos shook his head lightly, raised his fist lightly, and suddenly punched out. One bone. Boom. For a moment, the battlefield was ravaged by fierce winds, and explosive fists surged out. Boom. At the moment the two met, dozens of slashes were stuck in mid-air, eventually completely exploding and being completely crushed by the pressure of punches. The fist continued to suppress the momentum, completely enveloping the burly and strong man. By the time all the dust had settled, the burly man had already fallen unconscious to the ground. I wish I had handed over the things earlier. Carlos walked up to the strong man and took out all the number plates, with a smile on his lips. This time, it can be said that he has gained quite a lot, not only the points he has obtained, but also the strong and muscular strength. We need to make his inheritance level advance a bit. Good opportunity. At this moment, a figure had already shaved and came behind Carlos. Just as this person was about to take action, he saw Carlos's smiling face and his fist infinitely enlarged in front of him. Bang! With a muffled sound, the figure had already flown backwards with blood on its face, smashing onto a huge rock. Raids are not a good habit. Carlos walked forward and also took the number plate of this guy into his pocket. At the same time, in a military ship's hold, on a large screen, Carlos's figure was prominently revealed. And the person watching is Zefa. This kid is a bit interesting. I got so many number plates, but if it doesn't work out, I'll just stop and stay in place. Are you so confident in your own strength? Zefa looked at the big screen and let out a heroic laugh. Indeed, there is some arrogance. A rear admiral also smiled and shook his head. In his opinion, Carlos has good strength, but there are also some strong new recruits on that island. Not to mention, if Carlos keeps doing this, it will consume too much of his stamina and endurance. Zefa ignored the rear admiral, but his eyes showed anticipation. He saw that the sword around Carlos's waist had not been unsheathed. This means that this little guy definitely has the ability to hide his strength. Chapter 9. Sweeping Invincible. You are listening at novel full.audio. Above the open ground. Carlos is still waiting for a rabbit. At this moment, another Navy recruit ran over. Move aside. The new naval soldier looked at Carlos, too lazy to talk nonsense, and went straight into the form of half-man, half-beast. This is an animal-type demon fruit-capable individual, with muscles all over his body displaying his strength. He instantly rushed towards Carlos and punched him. Carlos looked indifferent and also punched out. Bang! Two fists collided, and the strong wind blew everywhere. This new naval soldier broke his arm and slid 10 meters on the ground in a very awkward manner. How could it be possible? The new soldier's face showed shock. Are you joking? I am an animal-type demon fruit power expert, and I have lost so badly in terms of power. What kind of monster is this? Take out all the number plates. Carlos walked up to the new recruit and spoke calmly. Okay. Although this new recruit was very unwilling, he still surrendered under absolute strength and could only hand all the number cards to Carlos. Carlos took it and went straight back to the spot, waiting again. The new soldier saw this scene and looked at the two unlucky people who were unconscious not far away, and the corners of his mouth couldn't help but twitch slightly. This monster, I don't want to stay here forever. Time slowly passes by. Another Navy recruit arrived. This is a superhero with the ability to unleash most of the power from his body, but it was also defeated by Carlos without much effort. As time passed, new recruits arrived one after another, some skilled in swordsmanship and some skilled in iron blocks, but they were all easily defeated by Carlos. Slowly, Carlos could no longer hold the number dial in his arms, so he had to pile it up on the nearby ground, like a small mountain. The rear admiral who saw this scene through the big screen almost widened his eyes. Don't you draw your sword yet? Zefa looked at Carlos's figure, with an increasingly hopeful expression on his face. He is becoming increasingly curious about Carlos's true strength, so much so that he doesn't pay too much attention to other assessment locations. He will definitely draw his sword. The assessment is about to end, and the upcoming battle will not be so easy. The Rear Admiral also realized the issue of Carlos hiding his strength and immediately took over the conversation. After all, as the assessment deadline approaches, everyone will rush back. In this way, Carlos, who has so many number cards, is definitely the target of criticism. And the fact is that as more and more Navy recruits returned, they saw a large number of number plates and fainting people next to Carlos, all of whom were inexplicably shocked. With just one glance, they knew exactly what had happened, but still couldn't believe it. Because this is simply unbelievable. Immediately, everyone's eyes turned red. Anyway, with so many number plates placed here, how can we not grab them? Even if Carlos's strength is amazing, can he still stop so many of them? Let's go up together. I don't know who shouted, as if it were a spark, completely igniting the battlefield. At the next moment, everyone moved and rushed towards Carlos. Well done. Carlos also had an excited smile on his face. The siege of so many people made him feel pressure for the first time since he obtained the system. At the next moment, Carlos moved and his figure flickered around the number plate, fully unleashing his physical abilities. Almost every minute and every second, someone falls down. Carlos was also sweating profusely all over his body, and his stamina began to rapidly deplete. But he seemed to be completely unaware of fatigue, his eyes as if flames were burning, like a god of war, standing tall on the battlefield. I don't know how long it took, but Carlos was the only one standing on the entire battlefield, and everyone else fell to the ground. Monster. This is a real monster. All the Navy soldiers who fell to the ground and didn't faint looked at Carlos with awe in their eyes. Although being knocked down by Carlos made them very unwilling. But this world is like this, the strong should be respected by everyone. This. Watching this scene, the Rear Admiral of the Navy was simply stuttering, with a shocked expression on his face. He wanted to say something, but couldn't say anything. Still haven't seen it. Zefa looked at the flowing blade on Carlos's waist and let out a soft sigh. But at this moment, the mutants were born. I only saw a gorilla standing 2 feet tall and covered in black fur on the big screen, as if attracted by the battle, appearing directly on the battlefield. Chapter 10. Surprised Zefa. You are listening at novelfull.audio. How did this level of ferocious beast appear here? Zefa stared fixedly at the chimpanzee on the big screen, his face already extremely ugly. The strength of ferocious beasts is actually similar to that of sea kings, which can be seen from their body shape. This gorilla, although nothing to him, is too dangerous for these new recruits. So for every assessment island, Zefa will have the Navy clear it in advance, and will not let any ferocious beasts appear beyond the specifications. I don't know either. The Rear Admiral also had a shocked expression. He has also encountered fierce beasts of this level, and it was an unforgettable battle that almost cost his life. Ask the Navy on board the warship to come forward and provide support quickly. Zefa immediately ordered to the Rear Admiral. Yes. Rear Admiral dared not neglect and immediately took out the phone worm. I hope there's enough time. Zefa looked at the big screen with some worry. If a genius like Carlos dies here, it would be a huge loss for the Navy. Above the open ground. Carlos looked at the sudden appearance of the giant chimpanzee with a slightly solemn expression. He could feel that the dangerous aura on the other side was far from comparable to the new recruits he encountered. Roar. The giant chimpanzee looked at Carlos and suddenly let out a roar. It instinctively felt danger on Carlos. As the undisputed dominant beast on this island, it is necessary to eliminate the threat. Brush. In the next moment, the giant chimpanzee had already rushed towards Carlos like a landslide. Amidst the earth shaking and the mountains shaking, the giant chimpanzee had already arrived in front of Carlos at an extremely fast speed, and its huge fist was also thrown at Carlos. Looking at the infinitely enlarged fist in front of him, Carlos also clenched his fist with one hand and launched a direct bombardment. Bang! The sound of air explosion echoed through, and Carlos's figure shot out from behind. The power is indeed great. Carlos rolled in mid-air, releasing his own strength and squinting his eyes as he looked at the giant chimpanzee. Roar! The giant chimpanzee looked at himself and couldn't solve Carlos with a single punch. He immediately became furious and picked up the gravel next to him that was still larger than him, throwing it in the direction of Carlos. Chong! At this moment, the flowing blade in Carlos's hand finally emerged from its sheath, and countless shards flickered through the air. In an instant, the boulder in front of Carlos has turned into countless small fragments, weakly falling down. Carlos, who had finished all of this, held a flowing blade like fire and slowly walked forward. The giant chimpanzee watched as Carlos gradually walked, and unconsciously took a step back. Faced with this tiny human, he felt boundless fear. Roar! This fear actually ignited the ferocity of the giant chimpanzee, causing him to burst into an incredibly fierce aura all over his body and collide with Carlos. Do you know that the sound of your body breathing keeps reminding me to chop you off? As soon as the words fell, Carlos took a step forward and transformed into a silhouette, crossing directly with the giant chimpanzee, standing with his back facing each other. Puzzy! A blood line emerged from the giant chimpanzee, and a large amount of blood splattered out, dividing the entire body in half. This person is really a new recruit like us. Everyone grew their mouths and looked at Carlos with a look of awe on their faces. The Navy, who received orders to rush quickly, happened to witness the final scene and were also stunned. This generation of new recruits has really produced an amazing monster. The rear admiral in charge looked at Carlos's figure, as if he had vaguely seen a future great swordsman. Carlos ignored everyone and just sheathed his knife. Walking to the mountain-like number plates, taking off his clothes and spreading them out, putting all the number plates together, he put them on his shoulder and walked towards the direction of the warship. Anyway, there is very little time left until the end, and staying here is meaningless. In the cabin, Zefa, who witnessed the entire process, also had a surprised expression on his face and couldn't help but mutter to himself in a low voice. The breathing realm of all things. Zefa is confident that he will never misread. The swordsmanship that Carlos has just demonstrated has definitely crossed the threshold of a swordsman, even to the point of cutting through steel and becoming a qualified swordsman, probably only one step away. Ha ha ha, I'm going to make a reservation for this disciple. Zefa let out a hearty laugh. At the age of Carlos, he understood the breathing of all things. With such talent, even he couldn't help but admire Carlos's talent. The rear admiral on the side also instinctively nodded. He could already imagine that Carlos in the future would definitely stir up trouble on the sea.